The moment I saw her standing under my porch light at 1 a.m., I knew something in her life had quietly broken. I had been half asleep in my recliner, the television murmuring low in the background, when the doorbell rang once, then again, softer the second time, like whoever stood outside wasn't sure they had the right to be there. I remember checking the clock on the wall, 1:03 a.m., and thinking no good news ever arrives at that hour, especially not for women my age who have already buried a husband and learned how silence can stretch across a house like a second skin. When I opened the door, the night air slipped in first, cool and still, carrying that faint scent of damp pavement after a late summer drizzle. And then I saw her, Emily, my daughter, standing there barefoot on the porch, her hair loose and tangled as if she had rushed out without thinking, her eyes not quite focusing on mine, like she had traveled a long distance without ever leaving town. She didn't cry, didn't say anything dramatic. She just looked at me the way she used to when she was a little girl who had woken from a bad dream and wasn't sure if she should be afraid or embarrassed. I stepped aside without asking a single question, because mothers learn early that some moments are not for questions. They are for making space. And she walked in slowly, her steps uneven, her shoulders slightly hunched like she was trying to make herself smaller, as if shrinking could undo whatever had happened before she reached my door. I closed the door behind her and locked it, the quiet click echoing louder than it should have, in the stillness of the house. And for a second, I just stood there watching her, noticing details that didn't belong. How she held her left arm close to her body, how her breathing came shallow and careful, how she avoided looking at the mirror in the hallway like she didn't want to see her own reflection. "Sit down, sweetheart," I said, keeping my voice steady, the way I had learned to do during hospital visits and funeral arrangements. And she lowered herself onto the couch like the cushions might give way beneath her, like even rest felt uncertain. I went to the kitchen and poured her a glass of water, my hands moving automatically, but my mind was already somewhere else, turning over the past few months, the little things I had chosen not to press on. The missed calls, the shorter visits, the way her laughter had started sounding practiced instead of natural. When I handed her the glass, her fingers trembled just enough to make the ice clink against the sides, and she whispered "thank you" in a voice that didn't sound like hers at all. And that was when I understood that whatever had happened tonight wasn't sudden, it wasn't an isolated moment. It was something that had been building quietly, carefully, behind closed doors I had respected for too long. I sat across from her, not too close, giving her room to breathe. And for a while we said nothing, just the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking clock filling the space between us. And I realized something else then, something colder and sharper than fear. This wasn't the first time something had been wrong. It was only the first time she had come back to me with it. And as I watched her stare down at that glass of water like it held answers she couldn't say out loud, I felt a calm settle over me, not the kind that comes from ignorance, but the kind that comes from recognition, because deep down, long before this night, I had already begun to suspect that the life she was living wasn't the one she had promised herself. And now, standing there in my quiet living room at 1 a.m., that suspicion had finally found its way to my front door. Emily did not drink the water right away. She just held the glass between both hands as if she needed something solid to anchor herself, and I noticed how her fingers curled tightly around it. Not because she was cold, but because she was holding something back, the kind of restraint that takes effort, the kind that does not come from a single bad night, but from many small moments stitched together over time. I leaned back slightly in my chair, giving her space, because I had learned that if you press too soon, people retreat. And Emily had always been the kind of girl who would rather carry a weight alone than risk disappointing anyone else. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, each second louder than the last, and I let that silence stretch, not uncomfortable, but necessary, like waiting for a storm to decide whether it would break or pass. After a while, she took a small sip, her hands still unsteady, and I saw her glance toward the hallway, toward the door, as if part of her expected someone to follow her in, someone she was not ready to face. And that single glance told me more than any explanation could have. I thought back to the last time she had visited, just 3 weeks ago, when she had sat at this same kitchen table, smiling, talking about renovations and dinner plans and future vacations. All the things people say when they are trying to convince themselves that everything is fine. and I remembered how she had checked her phone more often than usual, how her laughter had come a second too late, how she had left earlier than she used to, saying she had things to take care of. At the time, I had told myself that life changes, that marriage shifts priorities, that a mother must learn to step back. But now, sitting across from her in the quiet of the night, those explanations felt thin, like excuses I had made to keep the peace. "You can stay here as long as you need," I said finally, my voice calm, not asking anything in return, not demanding answers, just placing something steady in front of her the way I had placed that glass of water, and she nodded slowly, her eyes still lowered. And for a moment I thought she might speak, but instead she exhaled, a long, quiet breath that seemed to carry weeks, maybe months, of something she had not allowed herself to release. I stood and walked to the hallway closet, pulling out a clean blanket, one I kept folded for guests, though I had not had many in recent years, and when I draped it gently over her shoulders, she flinched just slightly, not from fear, but from surprise, like she had forgotten what it felt like to be cared for without conditions. That small reaction settled something inside me, not panic, not anger, but clarity, because I understood then that whatever had been happening in her life had changed the way she expected the world to respond to her, and that was not something that happens overnight. I returned to my chair and folded my hands in my lap, watching her carefully, not searching for dramatic signs, but for the quiet truths that people reveal when they think no one is paying attention. And I realized that the distance between us over the past year had not been about independence or growing up. It had been about something she had been trying to manage on her own, something she had not wanted me to see. The house felt different now, no longer just quiet but alert, like every object in the room was listening, and I found myself thinking about Daniel, about the way he had always been polite, always said the right things, always stood just close enough to seem attentive, but never quite close enough to feel genuine. And for the first time, I allowed myself to question whether that politeness had been a performance rather than a truth. Emily finally looked up at me then, her eyes tired, searching, as if she was deciding whether she was allowed to say what she had come here to say, and I did not move, did not interrupt, because I knew this moment did not belong to me. It belonged to her, and whatever she chose to share or not share would shape everything that came next. And as I sat there in that still room, I felt that same calm return, deeper this time, steadier, because I was no longer wondering if something was wrong. I knew it was, and more importantly, I knew I was ready to face it, whatever it turned out to be. Emily did not speak right away, and I did not rush her, because I could see the words forming somewhere behind her eyes, struggling to find their way out. And I knew from experience that when someone has held something in for too long, it does not come out in a clean, simple sentence. It comes in fragments, in pauses, in the spaces between breaths. She set the glass of water down on the coffee table with careful precision, as if even that small sound might disrupt something fragile inside her. And then she looked at her hands, turning them slightly in the dim light like she was seeing them for the first time. And when she finally spoke, her voice was low, almost uncertain. "I did not know where else to go," she said, not looking at me. And there was something in that sentence that settled heavily in the room. Not dramatic, not loud, but final in a way that made it clear this was not a temporary inconvenience. This was a line that had already been crossed. I nodded once, not asking why, not asking what happened, because the way she said it told me that the answer would not be simple, and she needed to feel that she could continue without being interrupted. She swallowed and continued, her words coming slowly. "I thought I could fix it," she said, almost to herself, and I felt a familiar ache rise in my chest, because I had said those same words decades ago in a different house, in a different life, and I knew exactly what kind of quiet hope lived inside them, the kind that keeps people staying longer than they should, believing that effort alone can change another person's behavior. I leaned forward slightly, resting my elbows on my knees, not closing the distance too much, just enough to let her know I was there, fully present. And she glanced at me briefly, as if checking whether I would react, whether I would judge, and when she saw that I did neither, something in her posture shifted, just a little, like a door opening a fraction of an inch. "He has been different," she said, choosing her words carefully, as if each one needed permission to exist, for a while now. And I let that settle, because the phrase "for a while" can mean many things. Weeks, months, even years, and I had a feeling that in her case, it meant longer than she wanted to admit. She drew the blanket tighter around her shoulders, her fingers gripping the fabric as she continued. At first it was just distance, she said, and the way she paused before the word distance made it clear that it had not felt small at the time, even if she had tried to convince herself it was. He worked late, he stopped talking about things. Little things, like what we would have for dinner or what movie we should watch. And I told myself that was normal, that people get busy, that marriage changes. And I could hear the echo of every reasonable explanation she had used to quiet her own doubts. I sat back slightly, letting her words fill the space, and as she spoke, I began to piece together a timeline in my mind, matching her quiet admissions with the memories I had pushed aside, the shorter phone calls, the missed visits, the way she had stopped asking me for advice on simple things, as if she had been trying to handle everything on her own. Then there was someone else, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. And even though the words were soft, they landed with a clarity that needed no elaboration, and she closed her eyes for a moment, as if saying it out loud made it more real than she had been prepared for. I did not react, not outwardly, because this was not the moment for shock or anger. This was the moment for steadiness, and she opened her eyes again, looking at me with something like relief mixed with fear, as if she had expected the room to shift, to change, but instead found it exactly as it had been, quiet, grounded, waiting. I thought it would pass, she added, her voice breaking just slightly on the last word, not enough to lose control, but enough to reveal the weight she had been carrying. And I understood then that this was only the beginning, not the full story, just the first piece she was ready to place on the table. And as I listened, I felt that same calm settle deeper within me, not because the situation was simple, but because it was becoming clear, and clarity, even when it is painful, is something you can work with. Emily did not look at me when she said it, and that told me more than the words themselves, because people only avoid eye contact when they are still trying to protect something, even after it has already broken. She kept her gaze fixed on the floor, tracing invisible lines with her eyes as if she could organize her thoughts by following them. And I let the silence stretch again, because I knew there was more beneath that single sentence, more she had not yet found the courage to say. I did not tell you, she continued after a moment, her voice quieter now, because I thought it was my fault somehow. And I felt something shift inside me, not surprise, not disbelief, but recognition, because that is how these things take root, slowly, quietly, convincing you that if something feels wrong, it must be something you did not do right. I leaned back slightly, keeping my expression neutral, not because I did not feel anything, but because I wanted her to keep going, and she did, her words gaining a fragile momentum. He said I was overreacting, she said, almost repeating it, as if hearing it out loud might finally show how little sense it made. That I was imagining things, that I was making problems where there were none. And I could see the conflict in her face, the part of her that had believed him and the part that had known better but stayed quiet. I folded my hands together, steady, patient, because this was not about correcting her or explaining anything yet. This was about letting her see the pattern for herself, and she exhaled slowly, her shoulders dropping just a fraction, like she was finally allowing herself to admit what she had been holding back. I started to change, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I stopped asking questions. I stopped bringing things up. I thought if I just made things easier, it would go back to how it used to be. And there it was, the quiet compromise that never fixes anything, only delays the moment when the truth can no longer be ignored. I glanced briefly at the window, the faint outline of the porch light still glowing outside, and I thought about how many nights she must have spent trying to make sense of something that refused to make sense. How many times she had chosen silence over confrontation, hoping that silence would somehow restore what had already shifted. But it did not, she added, her voice tightening slightly on the last word, and she looked up at me then, finally, her eyes searching my face for something, maybe permission, maybe understanding, and I met her gaze without hesitation, steady and calm, because I wanted her to see that she did not have to explain everything perfectly to be believed. It just got quieter, she said, pausing as if the word did not quite capture it. But it was the closest she could come, and I understood exactly what she meant. because quiet can be the loudest warning when it replaces what used to. Be normal. When conversations shrink and presence feels conditional. She shifted slightly on the couch, pulling the blanket tighter around herself, and I noticed how she kept adjusting it, as if she needed something constant to hold on to, something that would not change no matter what she said next. I saw messages, she admitted after a long pause, her voice steadying just enough to carry the truth forward. Not at first, not all at once, just little things that did not add up, and when I asked, he said it was nothing, that I was reading too much into it. And she gave a small, tired shake of her head, like she was finally seeing how those explanations had been designed to keep her uncertain. I did not interrupt, did not offer my own thoughts, because she was building something important now, piece by piece, and it needed to come from her, not from me. Tonight, she said, her voice slowing again. I realized I could not keep pretending anymore, and the way she said it made it clear that this night had not created the situation. It had only revealed what had been there all along. And as I listened, I felt that same calm settle even deeper, because the picture was no longer incomplete, it was forming, and once something is clear, you can begin to decide what to do with it. Emily's words lingered in the air long after she finished speaking, and I could tell she was waiting for something from me. Maybe a reaction, maybe a question, maybe even a judgment she had already prepared herself to accept, but I gave her none of those, because what she needed in that moment was not correction or instruction, it was steadiness. I reached for the edge of the blanket and adjusted it slightly over her shoulders, a small, simple gesture, but one that grounded the moment back into something real, something safe, and she let out a quiet breath as if that alone had eased a tension she had been holding for far too long. You did what you thought was right, I said finally, my voice calm and even, not to reassure her in a shallow way, but to acknowledge the truth of her effort, because it takes strength to keep trying even when something feels wrong, even if that strength has been misplaced. She shook her head slightly, a faint movement, but enough to show that she was beginning to see things differently now. And that was important, because clarity does not come all at once, it comes in layers, each one harder to ignore than the last. I kept telling myself it would change, she said, her voice steadier now, as if speaking had given her a kind of permission she had not allowed herself before. That if I just waited, if I did not push, if I stayed patient, it would go back to how it was in the beginning. And I nodded once, not because I believed that, but because I understood why she had. I glanced toward the kitchen for a moment, the familiar shape of the table visible under the dim light, and I remembered how many times she had sat there years ago, talking about her plans, her excitement, her certainty that she had found something lasting, and I realized how far she had traveled from that version of herself without fully noticing it. But tonight felt different, she continued, her hands tightening slightly around the edge of the blanket, like something shifted and I could not pretend anymore. And there was a quiet finality in her tone now, not dramatic, not loud, but firm in a way that suggested this was not just another moment of doubt. This was a realization she could not set aside. I leaned back in my chair again, studying her carefully, not for signs of weakness, but for signs of resolve, and I could see it there, faint but present, like the first light before sunrise. I packed a small bag, she added, almost as an afterthought. Not much, just what I could carry without thinking too much about it. And that detail stayed with me, because leaving without overthinking means you have already decided something important, even if you have not said it out loud yet. I folded my hands together again, feeling that same calm settle deeper inside me, the kind that does not come from hope, but from understanding, because I knew now that this was not a temporary situation. This was a turning point, and turning points require more than comfort. They require direction. You are here now, I said quietly, not as a question, not as a suggestion, but as a statement of fact, something solid she could hold on to. And she looked at me then, really looked at me, as if she was measuring the weight of those words, and after a moment, she nodded, slowly but with certainty. The house remained still around us, the quiet no longer heavy but focused, like everything had narrowed down to this moment, this decision, this shift from uncertainty to something clearer. And as I sat there across from my daughter, I understood that whatever came next would not be about going back to how things were. It would be about moving forward with what we now knew. And for the first time that night, I was no longer just listening, I was beginning to think about what needed to be done. The moment Emily nodded, something in the room shifted again, not dramatically, but enough for me to feel it settle into place, like a decision had been made even if it had not yet been spoken out loud. I stood up slowly, not in a hurry, not with urgency, but with purpose, and walked toward the kitchen, the soft hum of the refrigerator growing slightly louder as I stepped into the dim light. And I reached for the kettle out of habit, filling it with water and setting it on the stove, because there are moments in life when simple routines are not about comfort. They are about creating a sense of control when everything else feels uncertain. Behind me, I could hear the faint rustle of the blanket as Emily adjusted it again, and I imagined her watching me, trying to understand why I was not reacting the way she might have expected, why I was not asking rapid questions or expressing shock. But the truth was, I had learned a long time ago that strong reactions rarely help in situations that require clarity. When the kettle began to warm, I leaned lightly against the counter, my mind moving through the pieces she had given me, not rushing, not jumping to conclusions, just placing each one where it belonged. And I realized that what mattered most right now was not what had already happened, but what would happen next. I returned to the living room with 2 cups, setting one down gently in front of her, the steam rising slowly between us, and she looked at it for a moment before wrapping her hands around it, the warmth grounding her in a way the cold water had not. "You are safe here," I said quietly, the words simple but deliberate, not exaggerated, not emotional, just clear, and she nodded again, this time more firmly, as if hearing it aloud made it real in a way she could finally accept. I sat back down across from her, my posture relaxed but attentive, and I watched as she took a small sip, her shoulders lowering slightly, the tension easing just enough to show that she was beginning to settle. And I knew that this was the moment where things could either drift back into uncertainty or move forward into something more defined. "We do not have to decide everything tonight," I continued, keeping my voice even, measured, because decisions made in exhaustion are rarely the right ones. "But we do need to be clear about one thing." And she looked up at me again, her eyes more focused now. Waiting, I held her gaze, not to pressure her, but to anchor her, and I said, "You are not going back to something that made you feel this way." And the words were not a command, not a demand, but a boundary, one that I placed gently but firmly between her and whatever she had left behind. She inhaled slowly, as if weighing that statement, and for a moment I saw hesitation flicker across her face, not because she disagreed, but because leaving something familiar, even when it is wrong, is never easy. "I know," she said softly, her voice steadier than before, and that was enough, not a full plan, not a detailed answer, but a direction, and direction is what turns confusion into movement. I leaned back slightly, letting the silence return once more, but this time it felt different, no longer heavy or uncertain, but purposeful, like a pause between steps rather than a stop. My thoughts moved ahead, quietly, carefully, considering what needed to be done, what needed to be protected, what needed to be understood before anything else could happen. And I realized that while Emily had just reached her turning point, I had reached mine earlier than she knew, long before this night. In the small details I had chosen not to ignore completely, in the instincts I had learned to trust even when I could not yet explain them. I looked at her again, really looked this time, not just as my daughter, but as someone standing at the edge of a change she could not reverse. And I felt that same calm settle deeper, stronger, because I was no longer waiting for answers. I was preparing for what came after them. Emily held the cup in both hands, the steam rising slowly between her fingers, and for a while neither of us spoke, not because there was nothing left to say, but because something had already been decided in the quiet space between us. I watched her carefully, noticing how her breathing had steadied, how her shoulders no longer felt as tightly drawn inward, and I recognized that shift for what it was, not relief exactly, but the beginning of acceptance, the moment when a person stops trying to fix what cannot be fixed and starts facing what must come next. "What if he calls?" she said suddenly, her voice low but clearer than before, and I could hear the uncertainty in it, not fear in the way people often expect, but the lingering pull of something familiar, something that still held a place in her life simply because it had been there for so long. I did not answer right away, because the question itself mattered more than the answer, and I could tell she was not just asking about a phone call. She was asking about everything that came with it, the explanations, the apologies, the promises that might sound convincing in the moment, but would not change what had already happened. I leaned back slightly, considering my words carefully, not to soften them, but to make sure they were clear. Then you decide whether you want to answer, I said, keeping my tone steady, not forceful, not dismissive, just grounded. And she looked at me, her brow tightening slightly as if she had expected something more definitive, something that would take the responsibility off her shoulders. It is not that simple, she replied after a moment, and I nodded, because she was right. It never is. But complexity does not remove choice, it only makes it harder to see. No, it is not. I agreed quietly. But it is still yours. And that was the part one needed her to understand. Not tonight. Not all at once. But enough to begin shifting how she saw her situation. She lowered her gaze again, her fingers tightening around the cup, and I could almost see the thoughts moving through her mind. The memories, the justifications, the doubts that had kept her in place for so long. And I did not interrupt them, because people need to hear their own thoughts clearly before they can change them. The house remained still around us, the faint hum of the heater now blending with the ticking clock. And I found myself thinking about how many times I had sat in silence like this in my own life, weighing decisions that no one else could make for me, understanding that clarity does not come from being told what to do. It comes from realizing what you can no longer accept. Emily took another sip from the cup, her hand steadier now, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a different tone, quieter but more certain. I cannot go back, she said, not as a question, not as a hope, but as a statement she was testing against the reality of the moment, and I met her gaze, holding it just long enough for her to see that I understood, that I agreed without needing to say it explicitly. I nodded once, slowly, and said nothing more, because sometimes silence is the strongest confirmation you can give. She exhaled again, longer this time, and leaned back slightly into the couch, the blanket still wrapped around her shoulders, and I saw something else begin to take shape in her expression. Not resolution yet, but the beginning of it, the first step toward rebuilding something that had been quietly dismantled over time. I shifted in my chair, my mind already moving ahead again, not rushing, not forcing, but organizing, considering what needed to be done, what needed to be protected, and what could no longer be ignored. And I realized that while Emily was just beginning to step away from what had held her back, I was already preparing for what might try to pull her in again. And as I sat there in that quiet room, watching her steady herself piece by piece, I understood that the next part of this would not be about reacting. It would be about making sure that whatever came next, we would be ready for it. Emily's words seemed to settle into the walls around us, not fading, but anchoring themselves there. And I could tell that something inside her had crossed a line she would not step back over, even if she did not yet know what the path ahead would look like. I stood slowly and walked toward the hallway, turning on the soft light near the guest room, the familiar glow spilling into the living space. And for a moment, I paused at the doorway, remembering how long it had been since that room had been used, how it had quietly become more of a memory than a space. And now, without planning for it, it had purpose again. You should get some rest, I said gently, not as a dismissal, but as a next step, something simple and manageable, because the mind cannot carry everything at once without breaking under the weight of it. She hesitated, glancing down at the cup still in her hands, then toward the hallway, as if the idea of lying down felt unfamiliar, like rest required a kind of safety she had not fully accepted yet. I did not rush her. I simply waited, giving her time to let the idea settle. And after a moment, she placed the cup carefully on the table and stood, her movement slower but steadier than before. And when she took a few steps toward the hallway, I noticed that her posture had shifted again, not completely relaxed, but no longer as guarded as when she first arrived. I led her into the room and pulled back the covers, the soft cotton sheets cool and untouched, and she paused at the edge of the bed, her hand resting lightly on the blanket as if testing whether this space truly belonged to her for the night. You are not a guest here, I said quietly, sensing the hesitation she could not quite explain. This is your home too. And she looked at me, something in her expression softening, not relief exactly, but recognition, as if she had been waiting to hear those words without realizing it. She nodded once and sat down on the edge of the bed, her shoulders lowering slightly as she took in the room, the stillness, the absence of tension that had followed her through the door earlier that night. I stepped back toward the doorway, giving her privacy, but before I left, I noticed her glance at her phone resting in her bag, the screen dark, silent, but holding the possibility of interruption, of something trying to reach back into this space we had just created. I did not mention it, not yet, because some decisions need to come from within, but I saw the way her eyes lingered there, and then slowly moved away, and that was enough for now. I turned off the hallway light, leaving just the small lamp in the guest room casting a warm glow, and I closed the door halfway, not fully shut, just enough to give her space while still keeping a connection between us, a quiet reassurance that she was not alone in the house. As I walked back to the living room, I paused for a moment, taking in the silence again, but this time it felt different, no longer uncertain or heavy, but intentional, like the calm before something important begins. I sat down in my chair once more, my hands resting lightly on the armrests, and I let my thoughts move forward, not backward, not dwelling on what had already been revealed, but focusing on what needed to be understood next, what needed to be prepared for, because situations like this do not end when someone walks through a door. They shift, they evolve, and they often try to pull you back into them when you least expect it. I glanced toward the hallway one more time, the faint light still visible under the door, and I knew that while Emily was beginning to rest, I would not sleep, not yet, because there were things I needed to consider, things I had already begun to suspect long before this night. And as I sat there in the quiet, I felt that same steady clarity settle in, stronger than before, because this was no longer just about understanding what had happened. It was about making sure that whatever came next, we would be ready to face it without hesitation. I did not turn on any more lights after that. I let the house remain exactly as it was, dim and quiet, because too much brightness can make thoughts scatter, and what I needed now was focus. I sat there for a long time, listening to the subtle sounds that only appear when everything else has gone still, the faint settling of the floorboards, the distant hum of a car passing somewhere down the street, the steady ticking of the clock that seemed louder now than it had earlier. And I let those sounds anchor me while my mind moved through what I already knew and what I still needed to confirm. I thought about Daniel, not the version he presented at family dinners, polite and measured, always saying the right thing at the right time, but the version that existed in the details Emily had revealed, the version that lived in the spaces between his words. And I realized that what troubled me most was not any single action, but the pattern, the consistency of it, the way small things had been dismissed, explained away, minimized until they formed something larger that could no longer be ignored. I leaned forward slightly, resting my hands together, and I began to organize those thoughts, not emotionally, but practically, because reacting without structure leads nowhere. And I had no intention of letting this situation drift into confusion. I remembered a conversation from months ago, something Emily had mentioned in passing about shared accounts, about not really keeping track of certain expenses anymore, because it was easier that way, and at the time I had not pressed, but now that memory returned with a different weight, suggesting that what she had been dealing with was not only emotional distance, but something more controlled, more deliberate. I stood up and walked quietly to the small desk near the window, opening the drawer where I kept old documents, not because I needed anything specific from it yet, but because the act itself grounded me in a different way, reminding me that preparation is not something you begin after everything becomes clear. It is something you build as clarity arrives. I took out a notepad and placed it on the desk, not writing anything down just yet, but letting it sit there as a signal to myself that this situation required attention, not just concern. From down the hallway, I could see the faint line of light still beneath the guest room door, and I paused for a moment, listening, but there was no movement, no sound, just stillness, and I allowed myself a small measure of relief knowing that Emily was resting, even if that rest was not complete. I returned to the living room and sat down again, my posture unchanged, my breathing steady, and I let my thoughts continue, moving now toward what might happen next rather than what had already occurred, because situations like this do not end quietly. They often push back. They test the boundaries that have just been set, and I needed to be ready for that. I considered the possibility of a call, a message, an attempt to reach her. And I thought about how those moments often come with explanations that sound reasonable on the surface, but do not hold up when examined closely, and I knew that if that moment came, it would not be about reacting to what was said. It would be about recognizing the pattern behind it. I glanced once more toward the hallway, the quiet unchanged, and I felt that same steady certainty settle deeper within me. Not loud, not forceful, but firm, because I understood now that this was not just a night of unexpected events. It was the beginning of something that would require careful steps, clear thinking, and a refusal to be pulled back into anything that had already proven itself unsteady. And as I sat there in that quiet room, I knew that when morning came, things would not simply return to how they were. They would move forward, and I intended to be ready for that movement in every way that mattered. The night did not move quickly after that. It stretched in a way that made each minute feel deliberate, and I stayed where I was, not out of habit, but because I understood that leaving this moment unattended would only invite uncertainty back in. Sometime past 3 in the morning, I stood again and walked quietly to the desk, pulling the notepad closer this time, and I began to write, not in long sentences, not in emotional reflections, but in short, clear points, things that needed attention, things that could not be overlooked. Because when a situation becomes real, it must be treated as such, not as something that might resolve on its own. I wrote down names first, Emily, Daniel, then a line beneath them, not to separate them, but to define the space between what had been and what now existed. And as I paused, I realized that this was not about assigning blame in that moment. It was about understanding positions. Where each person stood, what each person might do next. I added a second line, finances, accounts, documents, simple words, but each one carried weight, because they represented areas that often go unnoticed until they become critical. And I had learned long ago that clarity in these matters prevents confusion later. I set the pen down for a moment and leaned back, considering whether I was moving too quickly, but the answer came easily. No, this was not haste, this was preparation. And preparation is what keeps situations from becoming overwhelming. From the hallway, the light beneath the guest room door had dimmed, and I took that as a sign that Emily had finally fallen asleep. Not deeply perhaps, but enough to allow her mind a brief rest, and that was all I needed to continue. I stood and walked to the kitchen again, pouring myself a cup of coffee even though the hour made it unnecessary, because I was not preparing for sleep. I was preparing for morning, and morning would bring decisions that could not be delayed. As I returned to the living room, I glanced at the phone resting on the table, silent, unchanged, but carrying the potential for interruption, and I knew that when it rang, if it rang, it would not be a neutral event. It would be an attempt to re-enter a situation that had already shifted, and I would need to be ready to recognize that immediately. I sat down once more, the cup warm in my hands, and I let my thoughts move ahead again, now more structured, more defined, considering the first steps that would need to be taken. Not all at once, not in a rush, but in a sequence that made sense, that protected rather than exposed. I thought about who needed to be contacted, not tonight, but soon. People who understood processes, who could provide clarity where emotion could not. And I made a quiet mental note of that, not writing it down yet, but holding it steady in my mind. The sky outside had begun to lighten just slightly, the darkness softening at the edges, and I realized that the night had done what it needed to do. It had brought everything into focus. It had removed the uncertainty that had lingered before, and now what remained was action, not reaction. I placed the cup down carefully and looked once more toward the hallway. The door closed, the light gone, and I felt that same steady certainty settle fully into place, because when morning arrived, I would not be asking what had happened. I would be deciding what would happen next, and that was a very different position to be in. One that required calm, clarity, and the willingness to move forward without hesitation. Morning did not arrive with noise or urgency. It came quietly, the faint light slipping through the edges of the curtains and settling into the room as if it had always been there. And I had already been awake long enough for it to feel like a continuation rather than a beginning. I stood from the chair slowly, my movement steady, and walked toward the kitchen, setting the kettle on the stove once more, not out of habit this time, but because there were steps to follow now, and starting the day without structure would only invite hesitation. As the water began to heat, I glanced toward the hallway. The guest room door still closed, and I listened carefully, but there was only silence, the kind that comes from deep exhaustion rather than rest, and I allowed that to remain undisturbed. I returned to the desk and picked up the notepad again, reviewing what I had written in the quiet hours of the night, the short lines, the clear points, and I added one more beneath them: timing. Because knowing when to act is just as important as knowing what to do. I set the pen down and folded the paper once, not hiding it, just keeping it contained, and then I placed it back in the drawer, because not everything needs to be visible to be ready. The kettle clicked softly, and I poured 2 cups, setting one aside for Emily, even though I was not certain when she would wake, because preparation is not about certainty. It is about readiness. As I carried the cups back into the living room, I noticed the phone again, still silent, still unchanged, but I understood now that silence does not always mean absence. Sometimes it means delay, and I remained aware of that without letting it distract me. I sat down briefly, taking a sip, and allowed myself a moment to consider the order of what would come next, not reacting, not improvising, but following a clear sequence, because clarity removes doubt. After a few minutes, I heard a faint movement from the hallway, the soft shift of footsteps, and then the door opened slowly. Emily stepping out into the light, her expression different from the night before, still tired, still carrying the weight of everything she had shared, but there was something else there now, something steadier, something that had begun to take shape while she rested. She paused for a moment, taking in the room as if seeing it from a new perspective, and then she walked toward me, her steps more certain than they had been just hours earlier. "I did not expect to sleep," she said quietly, her voice softer but clearer, and I nodded once, not surprised, because rest does not always come from comfort. Sometimes it comes from finally letting go of what you have been holding. I handed her the cup without a word, and she accepted it, wrapping her hands around it the same way she had the night before. But this time her grip was steadier, her shoulders less tense. I watched her for a moment, not searching for weakness, but confirming what I already sensed, that she had crossed into a different state of mind, one where uncertainty no longer controlled her decisions. "We will take this one step at a time," I said calmly, not outlining everything at once, not overwhelming her with details, but setting the direction clearly, and she nodded, her eyes meeting mine without hesitation, and that was enough. Because understanding does not need to be repeated when it is real. I stood. Then, not abruptly, but with purpose, and as I moved toward the desk once more, I knew that the time for quiet observation had passed, and what came next would require action, measured, deliberate, and firm, because situations like this do not resolve on their own. They are resolved by the choices you are willing to make once you see them clearly. And as I looked back at Emily, standing there in the morning light, I understood that she was ready for those choices, and so was I. The rest of the morning unfolded without urgency, but nothing about it felt uncertain anymore. And that was the difference, not the absence of difficulty, but the presence of direction. Emily sat across from me at the kitchen table now, the same place where she had once spoken about plans and future hopes. But this time there was no attempt to fill the silence with unnecessary words, no effort to make things sound better than they were. Just a quiet understanding that what mattered now was honesty and movement. I watched her as she finished her coffee, her hands steady, her posture no longer guarded but grounded, and I could see that the hesitation from the night before had softened into something more defined. Not complete confidence, but the beginning of it, and that was enough. The phone remained on the counter, still silent, and at some point, she glanced at it, not with fear, but with recognition, as if she understood now that whatever it represented no longer held the same weight over her decisions, and after a moment, she looked away from it entirely, choosing instead to focus on what was in front of her, and that small choice told me more than anything else could have. "I think I understand now," she said quietly, her voice calm, not searching, not uncertain, but settled in a way I had not heard in a long time, and I nodded once, not asking her to explain, because understanding does not always need to be spoken in detail to be real. I stood and walked to the window, pulling the curtain back slightly, letting more light into the room, and the morning sun filled the space gently, not harsh, not overwhelming, just enough to make everything visible, clear, and I realized that was exactly what this moment had become, not a dramatic turning point, but a clear one, where things could finally be seen without distortion. Behind me, I heard her stand as well, her footsteps measured, certain, and when I turned back, she was no longer sitting where she had been. She was moving, not away, not back, but forward in the only way that mattered, one decision at a time. "I am not going back," she said, not as a declaration for me, but as a confirmation for herself. And this time there was no hesitation in her voice, no trace of the doubt that had lingered before, just clarity, simple and firm. I met her gaze and held it for a moment, not to reassure her, but to acknowledge what she had reached on her own, because that kind of decision has to belong to the person making it, or it does not last. I nodded slowly, and for a second, neither of us said anything more, because nothing more was needed. The moment had already settled into place. I walked past her then, not leading, not guiding, just moving alongside, and I opened the front door, letting the fresh morning air drift inside, carrying with it that same quiet stillness that had been there the night before, but now it felt different, no longer heavy, no longer uncertain, just open. She stepped closer, stopping, just inside the doorway, and for a moment she looked out, not as someone escaping something behind her, but as someone choosing what was ahead, and I could see it clearly now. The shift that had begun in the middle of the night had completed itself, not loudly, not dramatically, but fully. I rested my hand lightly against the doorframe, steady and calm, and I realized that there was nothing left to question, nothing left to wait for, because everything that needed to change had already begun to do so. And as I stood there beside my daughter, watching her take in the quiet morning, I understood that sometimes the strongest turning points in life do not come with noise or force. They come in moments like this, when the door is open, the air is clear, and you finally choose not to step back inside.